a rule I made up for the temple. Whoever does a Dharma talk has to bring the fruit offering. It's a new rule that I tapped. And if you do it like 3 times in a row, it becomes part of the institutional memory of the temple. So I brought, this is thanks to my wife, Linda. I brought yellow apples. The next one's either a mango or some kind of a pear. I'm not sure. The top one is a cutie. I like cuties a lot. The middle is artichokes. And it's kind of a funny story. Mita Buddha is standing on a lotus blossom because he's enlightened. But when I first came here, I thought that was a artichoke. So I couldn't understand why the Buddha was standing on an artichoke. But this is what happens. This is what happens when you're new. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I've told you about Tom Wilson, my physics professor at El Camino College. I don't know if you remember, but every time we went to the physics class, he was really hard. And he always would say, well, tomorrow we'll have a movie. Like, today's lecture is going to be really hard, but tomorrow we'll get a movie. And so we'd study really hard, and the next day we'd come all excited, and there was never a movie. And he said, that's because the movie's tomorrow. It's always tomorrow. So when tomorrow came, that was today. So we never got to see a movie. But today we're going to have a movie. I brought a film to watch. And today's kind of an important day, or this time of the year. We have today's Easter. Today's also Passover. And my Christianity is so rusty now after 20 years. I forgot that Passover is Jewish and Easter's Christian. They don't go together. They're separate things. But they move around because of the lunar cycle. So, you know, Easter moves. And then today is Earth Day. It's always April 22nd. And they picked this date so that it would be in between finals and spring break. And they didn't want it to land on Easter, but it kind of almost did. So I'm not sure what happened there. But this day is kind of like most of our special services. You know, it's not really a holiday, right? It's not, I mean, I guess you could celebrate the earth, but it's more of a time of reflection. It's a memorial. It's a time to reflect and make the earth kind of foremost in your mind, at least for today. And then I went on the internet and looked. I looked up the colors for Earth Day, and the colors are green, so I wore a green tie, blue or brown. So these are all the earth tones. And I kind of wanted to talk today, too, about the importance of the earth to Eastern religions. You know, most of the colors in the Sangha area are earth tones. There's a lot of earth tones on the Naijin. There's flowers. So I think Buddhism is kind of more of a religion of the earth than it is of the sky. So that's something to think about. So here's April 22nd. Falling between spring break and finals exams was chosen for that reason. And it marks the anniversary of the birth of the modern environmental movement in the United States. It began in 1970. So it's been around. I'm a math major, but I always tell people I'm not an arithmetic major. So I'm not going to try to calculate how many years ago this was. But I guess it's 30 plus 19. So that would be almost 50 years. The idea for a national day to focus on the environment came to Earth Day founder Gaylord Nelson. He was a U.S. senator from Wisconsin. So that's kind of a heavyweight, I think, in our government. And this happened after witnessing the ravages of the massive 1969 oil spill in Santa Barbara, California. So I vaguely remember that. I was around 9 years old. You know, that's when all the birds and all the animals are covered in oil, and they have to be washed, and it was a huge disaster. And I think there's still oil, you know, washing up, and it's still in the sand. So one of the reasons why I picked the golden chain today was it says to protect all who are weaker than yourself, like to not be a bully. So, you know, we could think about the earth is, in some senses, weaker than us with the billions of people on the earth. And maybe we could all try to protect things that are weaker than us, and birds and animals, and plants. So I wanted to go in chronological order. That's always a good organizing principle. I wanted to talk about yoga a little bit, Buddhism, and environmentalism, and the importance the earth plays in all three of these traditions. And most of this yoga information I've also learned from our Monday night yoga class in the social hall. So there are a lot of foreign words in yoga. They are Sanskrit, and some teachers use the Sanskrit names, and some teachers use the English names, and of course some teachers do both. But everything in yoga is called an asana. So every pose, every foreign word they use for a pose or a posture or a seat in yoga ends with the word asana. They always say asana at the end. So this means a pose or a posture in Sanskrit. And there's lots of animal poses, and there's a lot of earth poses in yoga. And I kind of wanted to give you some idea. The animal poses are really well known, and people asked me, said, "You're not doing these on the Nijin, right?" And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm not going to do these. I'm just going to talk about them." I said, "I have my robes on. I can't." Famous one is downward dog. That's a really famous one, and my dog does that right in the morning. So they named these poses after actual behaviors of animals. So dogs do the downward dog naturally when they wake up in the morning. My dog, I think, does the puppy pose even more than downward dog. There's also caterpillar pose, and I always have to remind myself that insects are animals, right? They're not mammals, but they are animals. And there's also a cat-cow, where you get on your all fours and you arch your back like a cat that's mad, and then you lower your belly like a cow. I don't come from the farm. So this is an easy pose. I really like it. And in yoga, it doesn't matter how easy it is. It's the spiritual impact it has on you. So easy and hard is not so important. But in Sanskrit, tada means mountain. So yoga instructors will say, we're going to do Tadasana, mountain pose. But they don't say Tada Asana, right? It kind of gets, the two A's get merged together too, to just be Tadasana. So I want to show you a picture of mountain pose. So a lot of these poses on the internet are being performed out in nature. So this is this connection between the importance of the earth. So you're supposed to stand perfectly erect, perfectly balanced, really rigid, and really feel the support of the earth. And so this is called mountain pose. Another pose, I can't say this word, and I forgot to ask my wife how to say it. Rickshaw? I don't know. But all the teachers I go to always say tree pose. So I think what they do, when it's extra hard to pronounce, they use the English. So I've never heard them say this. So tree pose is this one. And this is like mountain, but it's on one leg. And this is a balance pose. And this is a lot like Buddhism. If you concentrate on balancing, you fall down. You have to find a spot on the floor and be rigid. And if you don't try, it's not that hard. But most of us struggle and try, and it can be very difficult. So this is called tree pose. Shava means corpse, and so Shavasana is the corpse pose. So this is the pose you do at the end of yoga. And again, these pictures, I didn't search too hard. All these pictures were out in nature and the importance of the earth. And so when I started doing yoga, I always thought, oh, this is great. I actually look at my watch when I do yoga, and you're not supposed to. But I was like, how long till Shavasana? Because I thought that's when I can take a nap, and it's over. But this is a completely wrong way of looking at yoga. It's like Buddhism. The whole 90 minutes of yoga is aiming for this crescendo called Shavasana. This is when it all comes together, and you really feel grounded, and your body and mind are united, and you really feel the earth supporting you, and you feel grounded, supported, and centered. So Shavasana is like the grand finale. It's the most important pose. It's not when you take a time out. It's not when you daydream. It's the whole point of the practice. And we actually had a guest at Linda's class Tuesday night at one of the studios in Huntington Beach, and it was a student, and he had to take yin yoga for his class on counseling. And he did the worst thing. I didn't say anything because I'm not the sensei there, but he said to Linda, it was a class from 7:30 to 9, and he said, I can't stay till 9. I got to leave at 8:30. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, you can't do a half an hour of yoga. It's a program. It's an entire set of sequences. And there's a beginning, a middle, and the end. And if you it's like walking out of a movie, right? In the middle. It ruins the whole practice. But I didn't say anything. I let him go on his way. But I felt like he didn't really experience yoga if you don't experience Shavasana. But he might have thought, well, what's lying around for 10 minutes going to do for me? But it's quite a lot. So I went on the internet and looked around for an explanation for this pose. And it says, allow the earth to lift up under you, to support you. Trust it beneath your body. Melt into it. Drop all your tension, anxieties, restlessness, and resistance into the earth. The more you can melt heavily into the earth, the lighter you will begin to feel. Allow yourself to feel light. So, this is hard to do, right? It's easy to daydream, but it's hard to do this. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about Buddhism. There's lots of different statues of the Buddha, and he has a lot of different hand positions, and they're called mudras, and they tell a story. They tell you what practice he's doing. So I just figured this out last night, actually. I never understood why the Buddha was holding this bowl. I didn't understand what was that symbolic of. This is the bowl of rice that Sujata gave the Buddha before he realized awakening under the Bodhi tree. Remember that really pretty young single woman that had the sweetened milk rice? Very good. Thank you. And then the other thing he's doing with his hand is he's touching the earth. So this is called the Earth Witness Buddha, where he realizes awakening and he's like, is this really happening? Or am I dreaming? Am I asleep? And it's like, I'm going to put my hand down, and if I touch the earth as my witness, then this is really happening, right? I'm not daydreaming. I'm not having a dream. I've done this sometimes too. Am I dreaming or is this really happening? So this is very important in Buddhism. So anytime you see a Buddha with his hand touching the earth, this is the moment the Buddha realizes awakening, and he asks the earth to be his witness. So I wanted to get to the environmental part of this. There's a really, really good video, that's 2 reallys, on the internet, and it's about how wolves change the ecosystem in Yosemite. So traditionally in the United States, wolves are looked down upon, and I often get foxes, coyotes, and wolves mixed up. So wolves are the really big ones. And they're also usually evil in our culture because I think ranchers hate wolves because they eat their livestock. So wolves have a really bad reputation. And they're also the bad guy in the 3 Little Pigs, right? They try to huff and puff and blow a wheat house, a stick house, and a brick house down. And then Little Red Riding Hood, I think, was harassed by a wolf, right? And then we also have werewolves. So wolves are considered to be bad guys. And so they were almost driven extinct in Yosemite. But what happens is, about 50 years ago, they decided to reintroduce wolves back into Yosemite because they were, nearing extinction. And what they found was, and they never thought this could happen, is the effect that a high top-level predator has on the entire food chain below it. So usually when you think about ecology or environmentalism, we usually think about the food chain bubbling up to us. So if bees aren't doing well, the flowers aren't going to do well, the fruit isn't going to grow, the rats and squirrels aren't going to have food, and then, the higher level animals aren't going to get fed, and sooner or later we're going to run out of food. But what they found is it's a trophic cascade of influence moving downwards. So having the wolves reintroduced into Yosemite and actually killing things actually gave the biosphere much more diversity and made it much more healthy. And I wanted to mention two things real quick. It's a technicality. I talked to Reverend Crane before we came out, and I got foxes, coyotes, and wolves mixed up. Sensei Crane said that they keep calling the elk in this clip deer. Deers. They're elks, they're not deers. And I don't know the difference because I thought it was a moose. And then, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is everything I use here off the internet, the reason why I do it is because it's a concrete, real-world example of the practicality of Buddhism. That Buddhism isn't something mysterious and cosmic. It's something very practical, and you can see examples of it all the time. Interdependence, how we influence things around us. But everything I use and I bring here, I just want to make this disclaimer. If you go on the internet, there's always a hater or a debunker who says that it's completely bogus and it's not true. And so I just wanted you to know that. But that's happened with everything I've ever used. So the internet's like this now. Half the people love this video, and science loves it, and there's a bunch of people who says it's complete baloney. But the same thing happens with climate change, right? And global warming. So, and I've read some of the hater things, and I've read some really long essays, and I just don't think they're valid. So I'm just trying to be fair. But I've read the debunking, and that's another weird thing. I thought if something was full of bunk and you debunked it, then that would make it true. But they're debunking this. I read it, and I didn't think it held up. And this is on like National Geographic, Smithsonian Institute. But for me, it's a spiritual truth that, well, anyway, I believe the video, so I'll just say that. So this is 3 minutes. I cut it down as much as I could.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Is it really helps us as human beings think about our impact, right? We're at the top of the food chain, and we change things greatly just like the wolves. And if we do it in a natural, mindful way, it can be quite beneficial, but it also can be very, very harmful. And there's a lot of things we can do. One of the big concerns right now, for me, I don't try to solve the whole thing. I try to figure out, like, what can I do every day? And like one of the things my wife and I are really trying to do is cut down on plastic. And it's everywhere. And everything I buy is made of plastic. So, you know, when I buy a to-go meal that's in plastic, I wash it and I use that for Tupperware, you know. And I always take my bags to Vons, you know, because it's reusable. I have water bottles that I refill, and we have those in the MPB. So every plastic bottle you save is important and valuable. Another thing I've mentioned before, and I think these may be going away, but those round plastic loops on a six-pack, you know, a lot of times if you cut the loops, it won't get stuck on birds' heads or in fish's mouths. So what I try to do is I try not to buy plastic. It's very, very difficult, but when I do, I try to reuse it. And there's also reusable bags you can get now instead of using Ziploc. So, you know, it's not revolutionary. It won't solve everything. But as Buddhists, you have to do what you can do. And every little drop helps. And Reverend Rada tells a story about a forest fire, and all the animals ran out of the forest because it was on fire and they were scared. And this little sparrow flew back into the fire and would go into the lake and get wet, and then fly above and flap its wings, and a couple drops of water would land on the forest fire. And the other animals said, you know, that's really dangerous, and it's not going to put the forest fire out. And the little bird said, but it's all I can do. This is what I can do to help. And so the little bird continued to help. So, you know, if every little bird did that, the forest fire could maybe go out. So I would suggest on Earth Day to not revolutionize your entire life or redo everything, but think of practical changes that you could maintain every day as a habit. And that's how change comes. It has to be something reasonable, reproducible, and practical that you can do every day. So, you know, really try to stay away from styrofoam. One of the things I've noticed, I brought a lot of props, but one of the coolest things I've noticed, and this is at Tokyo Central, when you get to-go things, they put them in this now, and it looks like plastic, and it feels like plastic, but it's paper. And I think it has a bit of a covering on it, so it's waterproof. But, you know, this is a huge step. So, and you could also vote with your money. You know, you buy the things that are packaged in an environmentally safe way, and sooner or later, you know, your change of buying habits will influence what is produced and made available at the stores. So I think on Earth Day, it's that thing where we stop and reflect, make it a priority for today, and then try to make changes as you move forward. So thank you very much. If you could join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Naman Butsu. Naman Butsu. Naman.